How do we talk with people we love and whose views we don't? Are there proven ways to get along a lot better with our family members and neighbors who see the world differently than we do? What are the costs of contempt and the benefits of loving your enemies? We get some answers. I'm Richard Davies with How Do We Fix It?
The best thing that you can do is to really try to have a connection that is warm and that promotes understanding. I mean, don't you want to understand where they're coming from and how did they get there? I think that that's such an interesting question. If we don't do that, especially, and we just try to lay out there all of the reasons that the way they're seeing things is wrong, we're just not going to have any impact.
Can you tell us about that phrase, love your enemies? It speaks to really the wisdom and radical teaching of the world's great religions, doesn't it?
That's right. It's a subversive and it's sort of a crazy sounding idea. But the idea behind most major religions ethically is that it's pretty easy, pretty conventional to love your friends or to love your family, although, people go in and out on that too. But to love your enemies is something entirely different.
Our show is about fixes.
Yeah, how to make the world a better place.
How do we fix it?
How do we fix it?
When you're with your family over Thanksgiving, Christmas, or other events, how do you turn awkward moments into rewarding conversations? Should you avoid risks entirely and sweep political conflict under the table during these weeks after the election? What are some ways to feel good about having difficult conversations? We hear from two wise people who've considered these questions deeply and have some smart advice. Tania Israel and Arthur Brooks. First, Tania. She's a psychologist and author of the book Beyond Your Bubble, How to Connect Across the Political Divide. We're sharing an interview that was first published on our companion podcast, Let's Find Common Ground.
The holidays are such a challenging time in this context of political conflict. And so I know people have some anxiety going into this time period. So the first thing is that often our ideas about people who disagree with us politically are misconstrued. We have these cognitive biases that cause us to see people on the other side of politics as being more extreme than they actually are, being uninformed or misinformed, being morally bankrupt. There are all these things that we believe about other people based in part on what we see in the media and social media, but partially in our own minds. And so if we can know that going in and have a more open mind to the people who we're going to be dealing with, then that's a really good place to start.
You mentioned the role played by both the news media and social media. So much of what we read and hear is divisive. It also reinforces the idea that those you disagree with are not good people.
Yeah. And actual human beings are more complex than what we are being exposed to in media and social media. And so if we're going in with a feeling of open-heartedness and curiosity to really find out who are these other people, and can I find out something more about where they're coming from that might be different from, or at least more multidimensional than what I'm seeing in the media. And one of the better ways to do that is to try to have some one-on-one conversations with people, because in a group context, we just don't do as well connecting and really being focused on that relationship and understanding, because sometimes it gets to be a little bit too performative.
So instead of shouting across the table, one-on-one conversations may be best with a family member who voted for Trump when you backed Harris, or vice versa.
So it's something we can even do in preparation for the holidays. We could reach out individually to some folks who we want to have that kind of conversation with and say, I know the holidays are coming up and I'm going to see you, and things haven't always gone so smoothly in our discussions about politics before, but I'm interested in hearing more about where you're coming from, and our connection's so important to me. And I think communicating that to somebody, well, and then you actually have to do it. Then you have to actually be interested in where they're coming from. And that listening part is so important. And so giving somebody uninterrupted time to speak, and then after they've spoken, reflecting back to them what you've heard and encouraging them to say even more before you even go anywhere near sharing your own views, that's going to be the best way to really create a stronger and warmer connection.
Tania, you're speaking to the good side of me, which is saying to myself, be reasonable, be kind, listen, don't put your views forward too fiercely. But there's another side of me, and I'm thinking of one person I love dearly in particular, that just wants to put them right. They have this crazy view of the way the world is, and I can't wait to be with them at Thanksgiving and say, what you were saying the last time about this, you're wrong.
I am the angel on your shoulder. So the thing that I always come back to is, what are your goals? What is it that you're trying to get out of this conversation? And reliably, there are 4 things that people tell me their goals are for dialogue across political disagreement. One thing they say is, there's somebody in my life who I want to maintain a good connection with, and we're having trouble doing that because of politics. Some people say, I want to persuade or convince somebody to see things the way I do. Some people say, I want to heal the divide or find common ground. And some people say, I simply cannot fathom how people can think or act or vote as they do, and that there's some curiosity there. So that part that you were just talking about with, I want to persuade or convince somebody, the thing is that by sharing stats and slogans, and here's the latest study that I saw, that's actually not going to convince anybody to see things the way you do. So you're actually not even working toward the goals that you have set out for yourself.
It's really hard for many of us to disagree with people, especially those who we love, without making moral judgments about them.
If we're speaking from our own values, then it's not that the other person doesn't have any of those values. They're just not their top priority. So the problem is that we kind of flip things around to think, for example, if somebody says, well, I'm pro-life because I value children. And then, if you're not pro-life, you must not value children. We flip things around so that the meaning that it has for somebody else, it isn't really what that other person would embrace at all. Or somebody says, well, I support gun control because I care about children. So if you don't support gun control, you must not care about children. So that there's 2 things going on here. One thing is that we might have some differences in terms of our moral priorities. And the other problem is that we tend to flip the meanings around for other people. So we assume that they are basically devoid of any of the positive morals that motivate ourselves.
Tania, how do you deal with people you love who believe in crazy conspiracy theories? That's tough, isn't it?
I think it is. And most people are not extremists. And often we think that if somebody disagrees with us, then they must believe all of the things on the most extreme of the other side. And so the first thing to do is recognize that we shouldn't treat everybody as if they're a conspiracy theorist, because they may not be.
But what if they are?
If they are, then I still go back to, well, what's your goal? What are you trying to do here? And the best thing that you can do is to really try to have a connection that is warm and that promotes understanding. I mean, Don't you want to understand where they're coming from and how did they get there? I think that that's such an interesting question. If we don't do that, especially, and we just try to lay out there all of the reasons that the way they're seeing things is wrong, we're just not going to have any impact.
In the case of a family member, someone we really love and care for, what should we be trying to get out of that kind of conversation?
Well, you might really want to understand them better. You might be curious about just where are they coming from and how did they get there and how is it that somebody I care so much about seems to be coming from a different place? You could also say, wow, I wonder what I'm not being shown in the media because we all have this confirmation bias where we're more likely to pay attention to things that confirm our perspective and to ignore things that don't. So there's probably a lot that we're not seeing. Speaking of pie, we're probably only seeing a small slice of the pie. And so we might say, oh, like, what are you looking at? What are you hearing? I'm curious about what are your sources? And rather than just jumping into challenging them, be interested in, oh, okay, well, I'm curious to know more about that. And tell me about how is that making sense to you? Because it doesn't quite sit with me, but it seems to really be a good fit for you. And sometimes, really why it fits for somebody has to do with particular things that they care about or particular perspectives that they already had before they saw that. So it's not even something that you're going to change their minds about.
Tania has this personal example of someone in her life who reached across the divide at a very difficult time.
A friend of mine, she had a family member who was dying and needed help. And this was during the pandemic. It wasn't from COVID, but she wanted to go and help to take care of him. But they had very different political views. And she was really concerned about kind of going and being with him. And was she going to be able to tolerate that? And she really was able to be with him during, his end of life and take care of him and see the news on that, he wanted to have the news on that was completely abhorrent to her, but she cared about him and was able to really focus on that. And also his friends who would come around, they also, had very different political views than her own, but they were working together in support of him.
Why do you feel so passionately about this stuff?
Back in the 1990s, I started a group to bring together pro-choice and pro-life people to have dialogue with each other. And I had been working in a clinic that did abortions, and there were protesters, and it was very conflictual. And I was so angry because I felt like they weren't helping the women who I was trying to help. And I was really in this angry state for years, and I got tired of it. And so, is there something else I can try? So I had heard about this group in St. Louis that was doing these dialogues that they were calling Common Ground. So I started a group like that where I was living at the time. And I reached out to the person who headed up the pro-life pregnancy center, and we did it in collaboration and brought in the people on our sides and people who really wanted to try a different approach, who were tired of what we had been doing. And it was an absolutely transformational experience for me. It didn't change anything about how I felt about reproductive rights, but it changed so much about how I felt about people who disagreed with me on it. I could really see them in greater complexity. It humanized them for me. And I was like, if we can do this, we can do anything. That's such a heated issue. And so after the 2016 election, it was so clear to me that we were having trouble connecting across the divide. And in the years since then, it's clear that we are still in such distress about it. And that distress is not only hurting our connections with other people, it's hurting our health. And frankly, it's hurting our democracy. And if there's anything that I want to do, it's to strengthen our connections with other people, our ability to tolerate and even embrace disagreement, because that's what we need for a healthy democracy. And I'm really committed to that more than anything else.
Tania Israel You can find out more about how she sees the world at TaniaIsrael.com. Here at How Do We Fix It, we've been doing shows recently about the work, the people, the ideas of braver angels. If you're exhausted by our political divisions and think there could be a better way to conduct our national conversations, search or Google Braver Angels. This nationwide citizen-led campaign is pushing back against conflict entrepreneurs and toxic polarization. We have more about them on our show page at howdowefixit.me. Over the past 9.5 years of our podcast, we've tried to disagree better. I lean left, and my co-host for all of those earlier shows, Jim Meggs, leans right. We've considered ideas from both sides of the political aisle. 6 years ago, we interviewed Arthur Brooks, the former president of the conservative-leaning American Enterprise Institute. Arthur is a true public intellectual, and one of his books is called Love Your Enemies: How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt. Those radical ideas he shared then are highly relevant now. So let's hear some. Can you tell us about that phrase, love your enemies? It speaks to really the wisdom and radical teaching of the world's great religions, doesn't it?
That's right. It's a subversive and it's sort of a crazy sounding idea. But the idea behind most major religions ethically is that it's pretty easy, pretty conventional to love your friends or to love your family, although, people go in and out on that too. But to love your enemies is something entirely different. And when you look at the great religious teachers from Jesus to the Buddah, they talk about the fact that when you love your enemies, you see them in a different way, you change your own heart, and as such, you don't destroy your enemies, you destroy the illusion that they were your enemies in the first place. We talk about politics, that we're treating each other as if we were intractable foes, enemies, and in point of fact, that's the wrong way of seeing each other. It's contrary to the teachings of the American founders.
In your book, you write, we don't have an anger problem in American politics. We have a contempt problem.
Yeah, that's right. So anger is a hot emotion. It's not inherently unhealthy. It basically says, I care what you think, and I want to change the way that you think because I care about you. It's an interesting little bit of literature on this in the social psychology world that suggests that anger is not highly correlated with separation and divorce among married couples. The problem is when you take anger and you mix it with another emotion, which is disgust. Disgust, which treats another person as a pathogen, not their ideas, the person per se. Anger and disgust are a toxic compound, kind of like ammonia and bleach. The kind of damage it could do to people, contempt does to marriages, it does to families, it does to friends, and it does to the United States of America. What's happening is, and by the way, contempt was defined by Schopenhauer in the 19th century as the conviction of the utter worthlessness of another person. It's a cold emotion. Anger is hot, contempt is cold. It says you're not worth caring about. And when you express that, the research is very clear. People will become your enemy. That's the best way to alienate people. This is an incredibly impractical way to treat other people because if you're talking about politics or ideology, or you want to convince other people, you want to persuade other people, the very worst way to try to persuade other people is by insulting them, by treating them with disdain, with contempt.
Arthur says a display of contempt affects not only the target, but the person who expresses disdain.
The interesting thing is when you treat another person with contempt, it's correlated with increasing levels of stress hormones, that you increase anxiety and stress in your own life when you treat other people with contempt. There's nothing good that comes with contempt. And the basic problem here, by the way, is not that we dislike somebody else's ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having disdain for somebody's ideas because they're wrong or even bad and evil. The problem is when we conflate people's ideas with those people themselves. And separating ideas from people is a critical ability that we're supposed to be able to maintain as adults. And yet, this is not what we're teaching on too many campuses. This is not what we're talking about in politics, even at the highest level of the American political structure. We're conflating people and their ideas and dismissing them with contempt. And as such, it's creating enemies among people who should not be enemies.
A lot of people might say that's fine as an argument against contempt, But your book goes a lot further than that and says, love your enemies, which even for many religious folk is a very difficult concept to accept, especially in practice.
Yeah. It's and it's just hard for me. I'm not going to deny it.
But is it practical?
It is practical. And the reason I call the book Love Your Enemies and not Be Civil to Your Enemies is because civility or tolerance are garbage standards. Anybody who says, my wife and I are civil to each other, you'd say, boy, you guys need counseling. Yeah. Or that my employees tolerate me. You'd say that I have a big morale problem at my workplace. And forget even agreement, because agreement is a terrible standard. Agreement is a form of intellectual monopoly. We need to disagree as part of the competition of ideas. So we need something that's a much higher moral standard, and we need something that we can, in which we can disagree better. And the standard for that is brotherly love. The standard for that is actual solidarity, is putting ourselves morally in the place of other people. And I believe we can do it. Now, the reason I talk about loving your enemies is because I believe that contempt in our society today is not just a terrible thing that we do. I think it's a habit that we're engaged in. When couples are quarreling and they're on their way to the divorce court, it's because they have terrible communications habits. They talk to each other in a way that's deeply, deeply suboptimal and dangerous, as a matter of fact. And so when we have the habit of treating other people with contempt, whether it's our spouse or our fellow Americans or wherever it happens to be, we need to break the habit. And to break the habit, you have to do something new in the place of the contempt that you used to feel. You have to expand the range, the time between the stimulus that you have, the feeling that you have, and the response that you choose. The tendency is to just, you treat it with contempt, you feel threatened, you feel angry, you respond with contempt. You take the time, choose a reaction, and you need to choose something radically subversive and positive. And that's choosing love.
Choose love. But we're very polarized. Many of us are more comfortable in our tribes.
There's a lot of literature that suggests that people naturally form into tribes. But that proclivity is not destiny. We're the masters. Mm-hmm. There's this whole idea, for the longest time, we were tabula rasa, that it was all environment. It turns out that was wrong, and then we swung back in the other direction, and it was all about our genetics. Well, the truth is, the latest thinking about how we behave is that it's kind of 100% and 100%. We have all these natural tendencies, but they have switches. They have moral switches. We have conscious actions that can turn these tendencies off and on. It's a beautiful thing. The classic example of this is that alcoholism has a hugely genetic predisposition. But if you turn off the switch by not drinking, if you have it in your family, you're not going to be an alcoholic. And the same is true for tribalism. Look, if you understand it and you don't want it, you can rebel against it. You can be the master of yourself. This is the most encouraging thing about being fully human, that we're not like dogs. We're not like, some pack animal. We're human beings, and we can decide to do something truly subversive for our own nature. Man, this is the most beautiful thing about these religions. The Buddha was telling people to do things that were against their nature, and that was the beautiful thing. If it feels good, do it, is the message of fools. Christianity is subversive to our nature for a reason, and that's what I want.
You're a conservative, so why should liberals read your book?
Why should they read my book? The same reason that I should read somebody's book who disagrees with me, because I want to have a more interesting set of experiences. What's really distressing about what's going on in the United States today is that we silo our sources of information such that all the television programs and radio shows and the newspapers and the columnists and all our sources of data, of stimulus, are those that say you're right and the other side is stupid. Well, I don't want to live that way. That's super boring to me to live that way. And it should be boring to everybody else because, and by the way, it should be alarming to other people, because that's exposing yourself to being manipulated, being used, and being bullied by people on your own side. I have data that show that something like 7% of Americans are kind of what I call the outrage industrial complex. And they're everything from politicians to members of the media to parts of the entertainment industry to parts of academia that are manipulating other people to hate their fellow Americans because they think differently than they do. They dehumanize people, and they profit from it. They get better careers. They get more clicks. Sometimes they even get rich and famous by setting American against American. So the reason that I want to read things that are outside my silo is because I want to humanize people who disagree with me. And I think that political progressives who, people I grew up with, people I love, who, by the way, in many cases, I'm quite sure are right and I'm wrong. I just don't know in what yet. And I'm not going to find out unless I read what they have to say. And I think we should share ideas and love each other.
And Arthur shared some ideas about how we leave contempt behind and express love instead. In fact, what he's suggesting is a radical change.
So let's start with rebellion. If it is in point of fact the case that 93% of us hate how divided we are as a country, but we keep participating in the problems that we have, the first thing to do is to start muting the 7% of people who don't hate it and who, as such, are firing us up, that are encouraging us to fight each other, American against American, or human against human. So basically, my advice, my first step in the process is standing up to the man, as it were, the people who are using their leadership to make us hate more, even though we don't want to do that. And I have a lot of tips on how to do that. Go through the list of the people that agree with you, the people in your favorite newspaper, the people on TV, the people that you're listening to in media, maybe your favorite professor who says, you're right, and the other side is stupid and evil. Make a list of them, not on the other side. Make a list of people on your side and X them out. It doesn't mean being contemptuous toward them. It means self-defense. It means muting those voices such that you can get a clearer view of what's actually going on around you without being blinded to it. That's step one.
Another step that you talked about was, as you're trying to interact with people in a positive way, if you can't quite muster up love, at least you can fake it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So that isn't one of the steps, but it's related to the steps for sure, because one of the steps is don't show contempt for anybody under any circumstances. But you can't break a habit by saying just don't do it. You can't say to somebody, just don't smoke. The way to stop smoking is to do something every time you want to smoke. Why? Because the nucleus accumbens, the part of your brain that governs habits, requires reprogramming. And the way that you reprogram it is you get a stimulus, you wait before you react, and you put something else instead of the old reaction. So every time you want to smoke, drink. So, for example, so every time you feel that you feel contempt, what do? I have this story in there about asking the Dalai Lama this question, what do I do when I feel contempt, Your Holiness? And he said, show warm-heartedness. It's very Dalai Lama, right? Very Buddhist. And I said, what if I don't feel warm-hearted? And he says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because, attitude follows action. You can make the personality you want. If you want to feel more grateful, show more gratitude. If you want to be more loving to your spouse, act as if you were more loving. It's an extraordinary thing. If you want to be happier, smile, crinkling up the corners of your eyes with these little muscles called the orbicularis oculi muscles and they govern a truly happy smile.
Is that faking it?
It is faking it, and that's the beautiful thing. That you can fake it and you can build the cognitions that you want. You're not a slave to your emotions. On the contrary, you can change your emotions. One of the most illustrative and interesting teachings about humanity that the Buddhists teach is that the emotions are an illusion. Emotions are an illusion of what's actually going on around us. Emotions are useful for helping us to process actual experiences around us and to process threats, for example. But they're an illusion a lot of the time. Since your emotions tend to trick you, you need to actually own your emotions.
And what about step 3?
Step number 3 is to get out of your bubble. Is to go where you're not invited necessarily. Say things people don't expect and listen to people who disagree with you with love. It's so empowering to do this. These days, it's harder and harder to find people who disagree with you because we're deeply siloed. And social media is what people cocoon themselves in. They substitute human relationships with virtual relationships with people. And that's a dangerous thing to do because every human link you break with somebody and put an electronic link instead, you will become more depressed, you will become more anxious, you will become more lonely. It's very dangerous, very bad thing to do. But it's also a dangerous business because you can surround yourself, you can curate your friend group in ways that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. You can silo your information. You can also do this by going to university where you only take classes and talk to people where people agree with you. And this happens all the time at major American universities. They were designed so that different people would be mixed together, but we get more homogeneity. We get more racial and gender diversity, but we get more ideological homogeneity. Very dangerous business. Don't do that. Fight against that. Find people who are really, really different. Embrace idea diversity. It's a thrill, actually.
thinker and author Arthur Brooks, who writes a newsletter called The Art and Science of Happiness. He has a website called arthurbrooks.com and also a weekly column for The Atlantic about finding happiness called How to Build a Life. This is How Do We Fix It? I'm Richard Davies. Our producer is Miranda Schaefer. Enjoy the holidays.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.